what I think is important, and that's what I found in my studies, is that they're under-researched. There's not that much literature on European naval forces.
Hello, everybody. I am here today with Jeremy Stoes, who is the author of this fairly new report, How High? The Future of European Naval Power and the High-End Challenge, that was produced with the Center for Military Studies at the University of Copenhagen. And it's super interesting, so I'm very happy that Jeremy is here to explain more about it. But first, before we get started, Jeremy, why don't you just quickly introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Anders. Thank you for having me. Hello to everybody. My name is Jeremy Stoes. I'm an Austrian American. I work in the field of security. I have a history in with the police as well. So in local security, then went into academia, studied history, and then went on to Kiel in Germany to study political sciences and security studies. I focused on the development and evolution of European naval forces since the 1980s up until the current day. And at this moment, I'm the Deputy Director of the Austrian Center for Intelligence, Propaganda and Security Studies, as well as a non-resident fellow at the Center for Maritime Strategy and Security at the Institute for Security Policy in Kiel, Germany. And I'm very happy to talk about the study, about European naval power, and all the other interesting things. Looking forward to the conversation.
Great. So we're going to do a few videos. So we're going to break up the conversation into a series of videos. And in this first one, I just thought it would be nice to sort of set the stage, maybe direct some of the very basic questions. So if we look at the title of your report, it contains a couple of terms that maybe we should define. And the first one I would like to ask is, what is actually naval power? What do you mean by the term naval power?
Thanks. It's good that we at first look at terminology, and terminology is important in defining what we're talking about is very important. So I went back and when I got the question from you, and looked at the different forms of and definitions of naval power. Sea power, there are a lot of people that have discussed that at length. I will use Ian Speller's definition, that is naval power is the ability to exert power at and from the sea in pursuit of national and multinational objectives. So that is the definition I work with also in my study. That's the understanding of naval power. But it is important to note that naval, and we often then, when we think of naval power, the first thing that comes to mind is ships, gray hulls. But it is, of course, so much more than just gray hulls, and is more. So there's more to a navy, to naval capabilities, to naval power of a state or to a multinational alliance than just ships, and that includes military capabilities, so the materiel, the equipment, be it the ships themselves, submarines, aircraft, weapon systems, not only at sea, but also from shore, space, underwater, across all domains. And domains also need to be defined. Domains can be the land domain, air, maritime domain, and then we also talk about the space as a domain. I also use the cyber domain and the electromagnetic spectrum as a domain. And in those domains, you can have naval power. But it's not just those aspects, it's also the personnel, it's the people, it's education, it's the industrial base, it's resources that all feed into naval power, and it's also heritage. And I think that's also important to think about maritime states with a maritime heritage that feeds into naval power as well.
Okay, so a very broad spectrum of different things feeding into the concept of naval power, really. Um, your title also suggests that there is a particular high-end challenge, and it's maybe interesting to just define here what is high end in this regard.
Mhm. The high end, and we're talking about the high end of the intensity spectrum of conflict. So if you look at the conflict and the spectrum, there is from no conflict, peacetime, uh, to all the way up to the high intensity warfare, be it nuclear or conventional, across all against, again, all domains, across borders, geographical borders. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about the high end. So high end of the intensity spectrum of conflict and war in this, and conflict in this area.
Okay, so it's the intensity spectrum we're talking about here. And the last thing about your title that I just think is good uh, to define or to talk about here in the beginning, it's the question of why it's interesting to look at European navies in particular. I think a lot of what we're going to talk about in this conversation is probably interesting for all navies, or things challenging for many different kinds of navies from around the world. But what is so specific about European navies that it makes sense to group them together? They seem very diverse when you look at them from the outside.
A very good point. I would agree with that. They are very diverse. I mean, there are huge differences, let's say, between the navies, and again, we're using quite a broad term with navies because they can be maritime forces, so not individual service branches, but part of the defense forces of a state. They might actually be focused on constabulary duties because they're very small, be it Malta, for example, or Slovenia. So very small for that, maybe just have a couple of boats, and no larger vessels. All the way to, let's say, the Royal Navy or the French Navy with nuclear forces, aircraft carriers, maritime patrol aircraft, satellite systems, all of, special forces, all that. So they are very diverse. I agree with you. They are as diverse as comparing the U.S. Navy to the German Navy or to the Colombian Navy. So yes, they are very diverse. What I think is important, and that's what I found in my studies, is that they're under-researched. There's not that much literature on European naval forces. Yes, there are many journals written. There are a significant number of books that have been written. But what I've found is that very few books and very few studies really try to assess how, the similarities, the differences, the developments of European naval forces. And that has two reasons. First of all, it's not that easy. And secondly, oftentimes historians deal with naval forces. They write those tremendously interesting books about the development of the Royal Navy in the 19th century, but they look backwards and they and assess also data that is available to them. And with current navies, many things are still classified. Historians will usually not deal with anything that is old, younger than 20 years. That is often the case. Now, there are, of course, exceptions to the rule, but therefore I find that it is under-researched, and there are similarities at the same time. And I think that's the interesting aspect. They're all, the navies we're looking at are all in Europe, which is the European peninsula, if you will, of the Eurasian continent. So they are set in a geographical space. Most states that we're talking about, or all states, are democracies, although there are authoritarian tendencies in some, but still they're democracies. They're part of what we call the West. They have close relations, very close relations politically and militarily, in defense terms, with the United States, and other like-minded democracies, be them, for example, in the Asia-Pacific region. So there are a lot of similarities, some shared values, or a significant amount of shared values, and a significant amount of security frameworks within which they operate, agreements where other states across the world look at Europeans in envy and saying, how close, we don't have that close a cooperation among each other, which of course helps smaller states and, name them. NATO, of course, being the pillar of the defense in Europe, but also the EU and smaller bi and minilateral arrangements, be it the Joint Expeditionary Force or Seebataillon, German Seebataillon working with the Dutch, and many others, Northern Defense Corporation. So I think that is why it's very interesting to study European navies, maritime forces. Plus, I live in Europe, you live in Europe, so why not look at that more in more detail?